Hello, I'm Dale Yurton, and welcome to our study on prayer. We're calling it Circle Makers, and we're looking at different aspects of prayer, how we need to develop that within our lives. This particular lesson I'm going to call the Circle of Obedience, learning how to draw a prayer circle of obedience. I'm going to use the story of Joshua when he comes to Jericho, and we'll take for our text Joshua the 5th chapter and verse 13 and 14. And it came to pass when Joshua was by Jericho that he lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, a man stood opposite him with a sword drawn in his hand. And Joshua went to him and said to him, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" And so he said, "No, but as commander of the army of the Lord, I have now come." Wow, what a story. Joshua is looking for a way to attack Jericho. He knows they need to destroy this fortress, but he's looking for a battle strategy. And he is confronted by the Lord of the armies of Jehovah. Wow. I personally believe that was Jesus Christ that had appeared to him there. It's one of those revelations of God that's given to a man. Now, when they come to Jericho, Jericho was a very, very strong city. It wasn't the size that was so intimidating. It was its fortifications. It was a fortress, a military fortress. Jericho was located, of course, in the Jordan Valley, right along the route, the major trade route that crossed across Canaan. And because it was this outpost right on the edge of Canaan, right there by the Jordan River, it had been heavily fortified. It was a fortress. It had been built to withstand any enemy attack. Anyone that that's going to cross through there, they've got to be at peace with Jericho or they are in trouble. Joshua understood that. Joshua understood that they had to destroy Jericho, because if they did not destroy Jericho, it would leave them open for attacks that would come from behind them. So they had to attack Jericho or they would find themselves surrounded by their enemies. Now, I'm taking time to explain this because I've seen a lot of Christians make that mistake, that they run up against a big problem. Instead of trying to solve the problem, they try to run away from the problem and just circle it, go on the other side and go on. And what happens is the problem doesn't go away. The problem begins to attack them from behind. So Jericho had to be conquered. It was, as I said, a military fortress. It actually had two walls around the city, an inner wall and an outer wall. The outer wall was 2 meters wide, over 6 foot wide. It's a fortified place. Then inside, between the first wall and the second wall was very high. It was 17 meters high. And so that wall was reaching between 50 to 60 feet. This is a very strong military place. So you got to get over the first wall. Trying to get over the first wall, they're shooting from the top of the second wall. You can see they have done their work to fortify this military outpost. What it looks like to Joshua, what it looks like to the armies of Israel, an impossible situation. What are we going to do with Jericho? It's a fortress. They are prepared for any kind of battle situation. Now, I'm praying that you are thinking in your own life about impossible situations, things that you are facing. How are you going to deal with this? How are you going to overcome it? That's what Joshua is doing as he goes out to the walls of Jericho. He's looking for a way to attack, to conquer Jericho, the military fortress. God gives him a plan. When he submits to God, God gives him a battle plan. I want to give it to you in 3 parts. Here's the first part. God challenges him to kneel barefoot in submission. Take your sandals off. You're standing on holy ground. And he bows and worships there. There's where it begins. It begins with our submission to God. Kneeling barefoot in submission. As Joshua comes up to Jericho to try to survey the city, looking for any kind of weakness, a weak spot where he can attack the city and prepare a battle plan, he meets a man with this drawn sword in his hand. And Joshua is not a coward. Joshua cries out to him, and you'll find this Joshua chapter 5 and verse 13, where he cries and says, "Are you for us or for our adversaries?" Now that's the question that so many times we are asking in life. Are you for us or against us? That's a wrong question. Wrong question. You need to find out who this is first of all. The man replies, "No, I've not come for you or against you. I have come as commander of the army of the Lord." Wow. No wonder Joshua bows in surrender. He understands this is not my battle, this is God's battle. I'm not going to be able to accomplish this in myself. Only God's going to be able to help me to do this. And so Joshua immediately responds in worship. He bows and begins to worship. He removes his sandals, which in that culture, by removing your sandals, you were saying, I don't own this ground. This ground belongs to God. This ground is holy ground. As he surrenders to God, I think of the story where the generals met on the warship at the end of World War II, and they were getting ready to sign the end of the war. And as they walk up, the Japanese commander stretches out his hand to shake General MacArthur's hand. General MacArthur stands there with his hand at his side and says, "Your sword first, sir." Now, he was right. Before you can shake hands, you've got to surrender. The same is true with God. He is Lord, Lord. And we've got to recognize that. So the first lesson that we learn in this is we must surrender to God. God comes to receive our surrender, not our suggestions. So many people treat prayer like it's a suggestion box. And we go to God and tell God what he needs to do. No, the first thing we need to do is surrender to him. Submit ourselves to him. We're not Lord. He is the Lord. And we need to surrender to him. So that's the first lesson that we learn. The second thing that we learn in this is anywhere the presence of God is becomes holy. That's right. Even Jericho was holy ground. Why? Because the Lord was there. The same is true in our lives. Anywhere that the Lord is holy ground. And you must recognize that. It's why it's not enough just for us to remove our sandals and submit. We need to bow in worship because this is a holy place. Now, if we'll understand that principle, if we get that right in our life and we submit to his authority, we surrender to his command, then God will begin to give us ideas. He will begin to give us plans. And that's exactly what happens in the story, that this commander of the armies of the Lord begins to give Joshua a battle plan. Here's what you need to do to be able to conquer this city. Now, the same is true in our lives. When we pray, don't go to God with your best ideas. Go to God in submission, surrender. And when you submit yourself to Him, God will begin to give you thoughts and ideas and plans. And if you will work the plan of God, you will receive the miracle of God. But you must submit to Him and allow Him to give you the battle plan. So that's the second thing I want to talk about. The second thing I want to discuss with you is learning to walk in silent obedience. First of all, you have to surrender to Him. You've got to remove your sandals and say, it all belongs to you, God, and begin to worship Him. Then God will give you the plan. Now, the second thing you've got to learn to do is walk out the plan. Do what God tells you to do. Now, many times, the plans that God gives us seem to be crazy ideas. That's what it seems like in this story. The battle plan that God gives to Joshua seems like a crazy idea. Why would anybody want to do that? Actually, we could call it God gave him a plan on how to draw a circle around Jericho. Here's what you need to do. The entire army of Israel was to march around the city of Jericho once a day for 6 days. For 6 days, they were to march around this city, and they were to be led by the priest. The priests were bearing the Ark of the Covenant and blowing the shofar, their trumpets. They're blowing the trumpets as they march around the city. Then on the seventh day, they were to march around the city 7 times. Now, what a picture of prayer circles. Marching around the city 7 times. They were to circle the city, and God promised them, I'm going to give you the victory if you will draw the prayer circle. God's done the same thing for you and I. If we will learn to draw the prayer circles, then God will give us what we need within our lives. Now, yes, it's true. This does not seem like a military strategy. They're saying, but this is a highly fortified military outpost. How are we supposed to conquer it? Just by marching around it. What you've got to understand, there are some things you cannot do yourself. But there is nothing that is impossible with God. Act in faith, obeying God. Now, in reality, the soldiers would have rather been throwing rocks at the city, throwing rocks over the wall, than just marching around the city for 6 days, 1 time, the 7th day, 7 times. And that doesn't seem like a military strategy at all. They would have rather been shooting flaming arrows into the city. Just let us fight this battle. The way they thought about it is, let us just beat the gates down, or we can climb over the walls, or we can cut off their water supply. There's all kinds of ideas that we can come up with and say, this is what we ought to be doing in our military strategy. And God says, no, that's not what I want you to do. I want you to march around the city 1 time for 6 days. And then on the 7th day, I want you to march around the city 7 times. Oh, the soldiers are saying, but we want to fight. We want to conquer this city. But that's not what God told Joshua to do. I'm challenging you, because many times the plans and the strategies that God gives us seems to be crazy, and we're wondering, why would God tell us to do that? God knows what he's doing, and there are so many things that are impossible situations. We're going to get ourselves in bad trouble if we try to work it out ourselves. The second thing that God says to them is, I don't want you to say a word. I want you to walk in complete silence. Now, I'm sure when they first came and started walking around the wall that the people in Jericho were terrified by them. But by the sixth day, they marched around 6 times. I can assure you, the people inside the walls of Jericho have become very confident by then, saying, they don't know what to do. They've never seen walls this big. They're afraid of us. I'm sure they were taunting them and mocking them and saying terrible things about them. God says, don't say a word. Just keep your mouth closed. Keep marching around the wall. Don't say a word. Now, 2 things that I see in this is, the first lesson we learn is obedience is the highest form of worship. Obedience. Just do what God told you to do. And if you'll do what God told you to do, then God will fulfill His promise within your life. Prayer is not telling God what to do. Prayer is going to God to get the instructions, what we need to do. And then as we obey God, we're acting in faith. Obedience is our highest form of worship. The second thing that we learn from this is we lose so many victories in our life because we begin to talk words of defeat. Negative words, words of doubt, words of unbelief. Instead of speaking the word of God, instead of saying what God is saying, we're speaking words of unbelief. It's better say nothing than to say the wrong thing. Somebody said, but I'm speaking the truth. Yes, but he says, speak the truth in love. If you're not speaking it in love, just keep quiet. We don't need to hear it. So many times we lose the battle because we're talking the wrong thing. We're saying the wrong thing. And we're defeating ourselves by our bad testimony. What the Bible called an evil report of unbelief. God help us not to fall into that trap. Now, the third thing that I learned from this story is we need to learn how to shout loudly in victory. That's what we see in the closure of this story. As they march around on the 7th day, they're to march 7 times on the 7th day. And as they circle around the 7th time, the priests have been blowing the trumpets and as they're marching and such. But suddenly, the priests give a long sound on the trumpets. And he said, when you hear that, then you are to shout with a great shout. Wow. What's the difference? I mean, they've been walking silently, and maybe God, He knows how we are made. Not only are we tempted to say negative things, particularly over a period of time, but if we'll keep our mouths closed, we're getting all that pent-up energy. I mean, we're ready now. And they shouted with a great shout. The Bible said they shouted with all their strength. I mean, the ground is shaking because the army is shouting as loud as they possibly can. And to their amazement, when they began to shout the shout of faith, the shout of victory, the wall started shaking and come falling down. That's something they could have never done on their own. It was something that only God could do for them. It was a part of the plan of God. When they did what God told them to do, then God did what they could not do. They did the possible, God did the impossible. That's the way He always works. When we obey God, when we do what God told us to do, then God fulfills His promise. God does what He promised us that He would do. the part that we cannot do for ourselves. And so the walls come falling down, and they all went straight into the city, because remember, they're all surrounding the city. As they've surrounded the city, they go straight into the city because the barriers have been removed. The walls have fallen down, and they march into the city with great victory. Again, I want to emphasize two important things that I learned from shouting loudly in victory. The first thing is, God has already given us the victory. You've got to understand that. You're not going to win the victory. No, there's no way. You're not going to be able to accomplish this in yourself. Not at all. The victory is a gift from God. And when you understand that, then that's the reason that they can shout with such a great shout of victory. It's because suddenly they realize God is fighting for us. In Joshua, the 6th chapter, in verse 2, the way that God addresses Joshua, he says to him, "See, I have given Jericho into your hand." What a tremendous promise. Now, this is before they march around the city. This is before 6 days, once a day, 7th day, 7 times. No, this is before any of this. God says, I have given. That's past tense. I've already done this for you. I have given Jericho into your hand. Are you listening to me? In God's mind, it's already done. You're fretting over it. You're so concerned about it. You're so troubled over the problem, the situation. God says, I've already done this for you. I'm just waiting for you to obey me so I can fulfill the promise in your life. What an amazing statement. I have already done it for you. Victory is a gift from God. It's not something you're going to earn. It's not something that you're going to deserve. It's not because Joshua is such a great general. No, it's because he's a great worshiper, a great believer. And because he believes God, because he has submitted himself completely to God and does what God tells him to do, God does for Joshua what Joshua cannot do for himself. When he submits to God, God gives him the victory over the complete city of Jericho without him even firing one shot. Now, here's the second thing that I learned. We learned that great shouts of victory, great shouts of faith produce great victories. When they shouted with all their strength, with all their might, the trumpets are blasting and they begin shouting, what a victory comes in their life. Oh, it reminds me of what the Bible tells us at the end of time. The trump of God is going to sound. And we that are alive, we're going to give a victory shout. We're going to cry out, oh grave, where is your victory? Oh death, where is your sting? These great shouts of faith, it produces great victories within our life. When you study this story, you discover that every soldier in Jericho died that day. Every one. And yet, the Israelites did not lose one man. Not one Israelite soldier died. All of the soldiers of Jericho died. Wow. Only God can do that. Only God can give us those kinds of victories. Only God can produce that within our lives. This is what God wants to do. And yet we keep struggling, trying to fight our battles, trying to overcome, when we need to learn to believe God, to obey God. We need to do simply what God has shown us to do. And if we will do what God tells us to do, then God will give us the victory. God will help us to overcome our Jerichos. He will give us the victory over the problems that we're facing in life when we learn to submit to Him, to kneel barefoot in the dirt and worship. When we learn how to walk in silent obedience. And then we learn to shout at the right moment, the right time, a shout of victory. Now I want to close this lesson by challenging you. What is our Jericho? Every one of us are facing impossible situations. Things that we cannot do within ourselves. But I promise you, my friend, there is nothing impossible with God. And the Bible also said, it's the words of Jesus, there is nothing impossible to those that believe God, those that have faith in God. There's an interesting story found in Mark, the 10th chapter, verse 51. There's a blind man, and you would think the blind man, when he starts crying out for Jesus, that you would know what he wants. He wants to be cured of his blindness. And yet Jesus challenges him. What do you want me to do for you? I believe that's what he's saying to us today. What is it that you want God to do in your life? What is your Jericho? What is it that you are facing? The impossible situation, what you cannot do for yourself. It's time for you to submit to God. It's time for you to stop trying to tell God what He needs to do. Just be silent. He'll give you a plan. And if you will act in obedience and do what God tells you, God will give you the victory. What you and I need to learn is learn to draw a prayer circle of obedience. Let's obey God and see God work miracles in our